let's talk more about all of this with CNN military analyst, retired Major General James Spider Marks. We have Jeffrey Edmonds with us. He's former director for Russia on the National Security Council under both Obama and Trump, and is a fellow at the Center for a New American Security. We have our CNN chief national security analyst, Jim Sciutto, with us. Jeff, to you first here, what questions do you have coming out of what you have learned? As Rubio put it, the ball is in Russia's court.
I think it'll be very interesting to see if the Russians latch onto this. While they're still making gains in the some gains in the east and in Kursk, Russian troops are tired. They're losing a lot of troops. Do they use this as an opportunity to, in a certain sense, rest and regroup? But the broader question is, how is this maintained going forward? What happens if there are violations? And what happens when Putin does not, when it appears he's not going to be getting his strategic objectives? What does he do then?
I do wonder, Jim, we were speaking with Ian Bremmer earlier, and he made the point that the momentum is on Russia's side. It's unclear at this point if Russia would actually take this deal without some sort of broader deal with the United States that would fold in Ukrainian peace into that. He's suggesting that Putin wants a meeting with Donald Trump. How do you see the Kremlin responding to this?
Listen, the momentum has been on their side for a number of weeks and months. They've been making grounds, though at enormous cost to Russian forces and North Korean forces that are, of course, fighting alongside Russian forces there on the front line. You know, thousands and thousands per week, but gaining ground. The suspension of U.S. intelligence sharing and weapons had an immediate impact on Ukrainian forces because while it was often described as just taking away offensive capabilities, not defensive capabilities. Frankly, it did impact defensive capabilities as well because they weren't getting the intelligence they need to strike Russian firing positions before they fire on not just Ukrainian forces, but Ukrainian cities. So that gave Russians another boost in effect. And bigger picture than that is that Russia's strategy, its gambit from the beginning really has been to wait out the West. That while this war has taken far longer than we wanted or expected, or frankly the West expected, that eventually the West will get exhausted and split and divide, and we will still be there. And listen, that reading has not been inaccurate, right, today, given the divisions you have between the U.S. and its allies and Trump's own comments about Ukraine, et cetera. But in the moment, this is significant because that intel sharing will begin again. And those words, I would say, from both Waltz and Rubio were significant because they said quite explicitly, Ukraine has shown, as the president has demanded, it's interested in peace. Now the ball is in Russia's court to prove that it is also interested in peace, or at least a ceasefire, I should say.
Yeah, that's the question, General, right? This goes to Russia and they go, no thanks. Then what happens?
Well, clearly, Russia has a decision to make right now, and it's very obvious that with Ukraine stepping up and making the determination that a ceasefire is in their best interest, there's a lot of entangled forces that are right now in Ukraine, and any type of a ceasefire, first of all, is difficult to initiate and then to assess. And through what filter do you assess that the ceasefire is taking place effectively? A lot can go wrong. And if Russia comes forward and simply stalemates and says, no, thank you, we're not interested, then immediately what has happened is the Ukrainians have in good faith said, we'll accept a ceasefire. This administration has indicated that they will immediately begin to resupply and provide intelligence. Then the fighting starts anew. And as Jim indicated, look, the Russians have maintained a significant amount of momentum, but still these are very small tactical gains that are being achieved at incredible price on both sides. So the Russians have the advantage of large numbers going to their advantage. The Ukrainians now have at least a guarantee from the United States that they'll continue the support primarily in terms of intelligence so that the targeting can resume. What you really want to make sure is if there's a ceasefire and it can be sustained, you've got to be prepared for the thing to go sideways at some point down the road.
And if it does, Jeff, President Trump said that he would follow through on crippling sanctions against Russia if Vladimir Putin does not express an interest in peace and take steps toward that goal. Do you believe he would keep that promise?
I think he might, but I don't think that they'd have much effect on Putin's decision-making in this regard. Putin has been very steady on what he wants to gain in this war, and I worry that any kind of ceasefire just enables him to rebuild forces and to recoup somewhat before starting on the offensive again. And to the general's point, You have to, we and the Europeans really have to have a plan in place. Let's say this does go on for a couple months. What happens if the Russians do start to aggress again? What are we going to put in place to stop that from happening or from deterring the Russians from doing so?
It's actually just to that point, I asked some folks on the ground in Ukraine, but also U.S. military officials involved in this effort. And a U.S. military official said, about the Russians abiding by a ceasefire, said they haven't before, why should they now? There's a track record there. And by the way, that goes back before even the full-scale invasion in 2022. There were a series of Minsk agreements, et cetera, where Russia said they'd do one thing and did the other.
Georgia, Crimea, et cetera.
Yes.
Exactly right. And so if it just gives Russia time to rearm, right, this ceasefire, how do you see this in terms of a strategic move on the part of the Trump administration?
It's a good question, right? Because there are genuine questions from Ukrainians I speak to. There's still doubts, right? Because I asked for Ukrainian reactions to the ceasefire, and they said, well, let's look at the fine print first, right? Which is understandable given the president's public comments about the Ukrainian side, who's responsible for the war, et cetera. And the trust with our European partners on Ukraine is, if not broken, severely damaged. And that's why you have Europeans saying, listen, we got to step in and fill the breach here. So one day's events and comments here, and even if you do get to a 30-day ceasefire, does not necessarily convince those parties that Trump will bring Ukraine to a deal that it and Europe are satisfied with, right? How much are they still going to ask of the Ukrainians to give up to bring this forward to a more lasting peace? It's an open question.
General, last word to you.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, let me pile on to the kind of the skeptical perspective that we all legitimately have. If the Russians sign up for a ceasefire right now, they can. Look, they're the art. They have mastered the art of what's known as maskirovka, deception to an incredibly high degree. They can agree to a ceasefire, and during that interregnum, they can reposition forces and they can get ready to initiate at some future state. So, based on conditions, the assessment of how the ceasefire takes place is what's most critical.
General, Jeffrey, Jim, appreciate you. Thank you so much.